Coming up on today's episode,
I will tell you, full disclaimer up front, that Universal definitely had this. You know, it was what it was, and if they are filming anything, you wouldn't be able to go in those areas as a park guest.
the Bry Adventures podcast is on now.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast, episode 2. I'm your adventure guide, Brian Rahman, and today we are talking about, we are asking the question, did you know Universal Studios Florida once had this? Let's just dive in right now. Did you know that Universal once had this, what I'm about to talk about today?
And we're talking about the Florida theme park.
I will tell you, full disclaimer up front, that Universal definitely had this. It's a fact. I was there. It's documented online, but it was short-lived. So many may not know about this. We'll just rewind just a little bit. So if we go back to Universal Studios Hollywood, we know that Universal Studios Hollywood was a real, and is still a real working movie studio. When Universal Studios opened in 1990, there was plans to open up this studio, the East Coast version, Hollywood East, if you will, whatever you want to call it. There was plans to make it a real working studio as well. So what do you have in a real working studio? Well, like its counterpart, its sister park in Hollywood, you would need to have some backlots. It had that. You would need to have some sound stages. It also had that. So what else is missing? Well, of course, the typical guest entertainment and also shopping, dining, all that great stuff. But there's still one thing missing. Have you figured it out yet? What does Universal Studios Hollywood have that maybe you're not so sure that Universal Studios Florida once had? Give up? The tram tour. Universal Studios Florida once had its own, very own tram tour. Now, Universal Studios Florida, as I mentioned, was kind of modeled after its sister park out there in Hollywood. And so was the tram tour. Kind of? Well, let me explain. The tram tour wasn't exactly like the tram tour that you would go on in the Hollywood park. The Hollywood park would basically go through the back lots, and the back lots were kind of off limits to the park guests. The park guests basically went around the front lots on the upper level and the lower level. As far as the back lots were concerned, most people weren't allowed there unless they're doing like a VIP tour, and even then they have kind of a smaller trolley, well, at least these days, that would go around. And even if you were to get off and walk around, it's for brief moments here and there. And if they are filming anything, you wouldn't be able to go in those areas as a park guest. So with the Hollywood tram tour, if you were going to see the backlots at all in Hollywood, you would have to embark and get onto the tram tour to see the different sets and whatnot. And furthermore, there were rides and attractions throughout the years specifically created so that the tram tours can go through. Some that come to mind: Earthquake, the original Kong, and the new Kong, if we're talking about today, and a lot of other various attractions. I've actually did a full deep dive into this in the history of Universal Studios Hollywood. You could go back and check that documentary out. It's right here on the channel. However, when it came time to do a tram for Florida, as I recall, Universal Studios originally wasn't going to have a tram tour, but they implemented one. And the difference here was you have to kind of remember that the layout of Universal Studios Florida and its backlots are exactly where park guests are going to be walking. Again, Universal Studios Hollywood's park guests would not be able to have access to just walk there back and forth onto the backlots. That was not permitted. But the Universal Studios Florida theme park, there were rides, shops, and attractions that were built in to the backlot facades. And really, most of the park was just full of backlots, so it was set up just a little bit differently. And of course, the Orlando theme park, Universal Studios Florida, its layout was a bit different than what Universal Studios Hollywood had. You got to remember too, Universal Studios Hollywood started out way back in the early 1900s, and it just kept expanding over the decades. But when the Florida Park was conceived in the 1980s and then opened in June of 1990, although it was coined as a real working movie studio, it really was first and foremost a theme park with a real working movie studio. Now, their intention, of course, was to get productions to film there, and there was a lot there. I guess it could be safe to say, did you know that Universal also had so many productions, films, TV shows, commercials, music videos done at its theme park in Florida, and still does have productions filming today, but they were more in an abundance back then, and this is outside of the Nickelodeon Studios. Nickelodeon Studios was their own entity that was basically renting space at Universal. However, there was a lot of filming in Nickelodeon. So in those early days, in 1990, 1991, so on and so forth, you had Nickelodeon filming, and you had a lot of the sound stages that Universal owned also being filled and occupied with new productions. And we'll go over some of those productions in just a bit. Now, I want to get back to the Tram Tour. The Tram Tour started in 1990 when the actual studio opened. It was short-lived, about 5 years. 1995, it was gone. But in those few short years, the Tram Tour took a lot of guests in and around the sound stages and into the backlots, which, keep in mind again, the backlots at Universal Studios Florida were really kind of like the front lots, if you will, because even though they were technically backlots, and of course you had the New York street sets and San Francisco and what have you, park guests were in abundance walking around. Now, I think it was about the first or second year the Tram Tour started between Soundstage 21 and Soundstage 23. There was a sort of open air courtyard, and that's where you would go to embark on your Tram Tour journey. A year or so later, the Tram Tour embarked from where the Nickelodeon studios were. But keep in mind, it never once went into a soundstage like its Hollywood counterpart. And even then, Universal Studios in Hollywood, when you go into the soundstage that features Earthquake, that soundstage was built specifically for that attraction, for the tram to go through. It has a special floor that moves up and down to kind of control the tram so it could simulate that earthquake that you are experiencing in the attraction. What did the Florida tram do in the soundstage area if it wasn't going into any sound stages? Well, very much like the Universal Studios Hollywood version of the Tram Tour, you would drive by the various sound stages. And most of the time, whether there was actual filming going on or not, they had one of the big stage doors open with all the props you could see for the particular production that would be filming there that day or that month or however long the production was there. You would go by, the stage door would be open, and you would see that. Now, those big stage doors, many of you also might know them, and they're known in the industry as elephant doors. Why that name? Well, way back when, they literally had to address the elephant in the room. Well, sort of. They had to move an elephant into the soundstage, and that's how that door became that name and everything. So yeah, it's actually kind of true. There is some truth to that. It's an elephant door. But anyways, those big stage doors, they would be open, and the tram would drive by. And if you were lucky, you would see some props and some sets and what have you from the actual production that is being filmed. Also in that area, you might have seen some screen-used props, as well as screen-used cars and vehicles that were in productions that may have not been filming at the time there, but they just brought them there because they thought it might look cool on the Tram Tour route. I forgot to mention, the Tram Tour driver or the narrator is narrating this as you move along throughout the Tram Tour. So you're getting an in-depth look and an entertaining look into filmmaking, and they're going over what the facades are when you go by them, you know, the recreations if they are, and telling you about the actual buildings and whatnot. So you are getting a fun, thrilling, I guess, entertaining, or as they would call it back then, and I think still we could call it this, edutainment. That's educational entertainment. So this is basically what the Tram Tour was. It was a form of edutainment at its best, I think. I absolutely loved and still love the Tram Tours. The Tram Tour came up to an outdoor area that was filled with a plethora of props, screen use props, and what have you, from all different various productions. Not just one production, although way back in the 90s, there was the Flintstones movie that was out that they were promoting, and there was a lot of screen used props that I believe were in the boneyard, and the Flintstone house, I think, was set up, and you could see the vehicles and what have you. So there was a lot of that peppered in as well. But while the tram tour was active in those first couple of years, the tram tour actually went by the boneyard, and of course the narrator would continue to narrate and explain about all the different various props that were screen used. And I think Bruce the Shark was there as well. It wasn't the original Bruce the Shark, but it was from one of the sequels. And those props sat there for quite a while. They were there for quite a while, and they would always kind of like, switch some older props out for newer props that came to the studios on new productions that had just wrapped or were out and they wanted to promote that particular production. So just in this short time that you're on the tram tour, you got to see the inner workings of some sound stages, most likely some screen used vehicles along the way, along the tram tour route, and then you pull up to the boneyard. So where does the tram tour go from here? Because now, as I was saying earlier, Universal Studios backlots are filled with park guests because it's the main attraction. So you probably guessed it. The tram tour made its way through the backlots with heavily populated streets. At times, especially on peak season, there was a lot of people, a lot of families walking back and forth to and from, and the tram tour had to make its way, navigate through all these people. So you could imagine it was a very slow crawl, and I'm sure that the narrator did their job and had enough to explain. I remember they even talked about the actual cobblestone, I believe it was cobblestone streetway, right before you get into San Francisco. Matter of fact, right before you get to the Beetlejuice Graveyard Review, there's that end section of New York, and you have a little bit of the trolley tracks embedded in there that will eventually make their way into the earthquake ride area. And so that was always fun. They talked about stuff like that. They talked about how they would make the facades, what the facades are made out of. And this type of narration on the tram tour in the Florida park was very similar to its sister park in Hollywood. So I have to say, all in all, the tram tour that the Florida park provided, I think, was very fulfilling. There also might have been some instances where you ran into actors on the tram tour over by the Swamp Thing set. The Swamp Thing set was way at the other side of the park. That's actually where Men in Black is right now. The tram tour did have a lot to it, not being exactly like the Universal Studios Hollywood tram tour, but there was enough there, I think, for enjoyment, especially in the first year or two. Did you know Universal Studios once had this? Well, here's something else. We all know that Universal Studios has a plethora of hotels now, and they're ever so expanding with Epic Universe and the hotels over there. Several of them opened in 1999. But did you know Universal Studios opened with a motel? A lot of people might not know that, but there was definitely, for sure, it's a fact, Universal Studios opened with one small hotel in 1990. Okay, I'll let the cat out of the bag. The hotel was not open to guests, not park guests, not guests off the street. Nobody could go and check into that motel. And you probably wouldn't want to because you might not check out. You see where I'm going with this? Well, 1990, when Universal Studios Florida opened, I think it was a year or so prior, they started building sets for a new film that was coming out that was going straight to video. And that film was called Psycho 4: The Beginning. So what does that mean for Universal Studios Florida? They had to start building a replica of not only the Psycho house, but yes, the Bates Motel. And that is why Universal Studios, in 1990 when they opened, had a motel on their grounds. It just wasn't working. It was a facade. So I just want to get the facts straight that this was purely a facade on the backlot. So by the time the theme park opened, the tram tour that we're talking about here would go by the Psycho House and the Bates Motel. Both the Psycho House and Bates Motel were unfortunately razed in favor for the area for Barney, Curious George, the Woody Woodpecker area, which is now the DreamWorks section, including Shrek. So on to those TV shows and films that I promised that I would get to. One of the films that we already talked about, filmed at Universal Studios Florida, was in fact Psycho 4: The Beginning. Again, straight to video. I watched it. It was, it was what it was. The fact that it was filmed at Universal Studios Florida made it kind of interesting. Now, here is an interesting movie that filmed there almost by accident. Literally by an accident that happened. Well, what I'm talking about is the 1991 film Oscar starring Sylvester Stallone. Now, this film was in production at Universal Studios Hollywood in the backlots there. I believe it was in the area or the vicinity of Courtyard Square, the famous or infamous square from Back to the Future. And it was a period piece, and there was a lot of old Model T type of cars and whatnot. And unfortunately, Universal Studios had suffered a backlot fire. This happened in late 1990. So with Universal Studios Florida opening in June of 1990, I guess it kind of made sense to bring the production down to Universal Studios Florida and film what they needed to. Now, there was just certain parts that were filmed down there. Some other films that are notable to mention, Problem Child, also The Waterboy, Adam Sandler's Waterboy. They utilized the sound stages. The Waterboy was filmed in and around Central Florida, so some parts were, however, filmed within the studios there. TV shows that filmed back then were, as we mentioned, Swamp Thing, Super Force, and also the new Leave It to Beaver was also filmed there. Another more recent film, not really recent, but mid-2000s, I think around 2007, the film Bring It On, In It to Win It was filmed there. It's a cheerleader film. A lot of the scenes there, they actually filmed in front of, I think there's a scene where the bus, they're in front of the Hard Rock Hotel where they're supposed to be staying, I guess, within the film. So all these movies are kind of fun to just see the different areas, whether you like the movies or not. I've seen these movies just because I just love seeing the theme parks. An even more recent film franchise was the Sharknado film starring Ian Ziering of Beverly Hills 90210 fame. And you can see some great shots there. They featured the Cabana Bay Beach Resort. Now, Universal Studios Florida was also home to several music videos. The rock band Creed used the New York area. They just basically made this huge basin on the streets, filled it with water. And also, Jimmy Buffett filmed one of his songs there in the New York area too. You could see all the New York facades. And NSYNC also filmed their music video of their hit, I Want You Back. And the video actually opens and you could see the New York Public Library facades. Now, for anybody who might be an NSYNC fan out there, and you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought the video to I Want You Back was more space themed. Yeah. Did they change the video? Was there two videos? Well, in fact, there was. There was two videos. In 1996, when NSYNC was recording their debut album, they were in Stockholm, Sweden. So they just filmed their video there in Sweden. And it was more space age. And that was in 1996 when that video came out. When the song started getting popular in America, they filmed a US version. Since most of them were originally from Florida, they filmed their 1998 version of the music video right there in Universal Studios on the street I was just talking about, in front of Confrontation and Safari Outfitters. So that, my friends, is going to conclude this episode. If you're listening to this and you've been on the tram tour, you have any memories to share, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear what you remember about the Universal Studios Florida tram tour. And with that, this podcast adventure is in the books. And remember to take some time to enjoy your own adventures. And when the time allows, come back and check out some more Bri Adventures.